This is Beyond Riel, a UMFM limited series that delves into the history, culture, and challenges facing minority Francophone communities in Canada. My name is André Marchildon.
And I'm Ian T.D. Thompson.
We are excited that you have tuned in as we explore La Francophonie in Canada. This series is sponsored by la Société de la Francophonie Manitobaine, the advocate for the Franco-Manitoban community. This project is also supported by a Taking It Global grant with support from the Canada Service Corps and the Government of Canada. This is part 2, exploring the culture of the Francophone communities in Canada. On our last episode, we looked at some of the cultural events in Manitoba, such as the Festival du Voyageur, French theater, and the French Improv League of Manitoba that connects the Francophone community. Today, we delve deeper into the culture of the Francophone community by looking at some of the original content produced by Gabriel Tougas. In case you missed it, here is Gabriel's bio once again.
Gabriel Tougas is a filmmaker and television director who was born and raised in Winnipeg. Gabriel writes and directs documentary series for national broadcast, and favorite themes of his include environmentalism, cultural identity, and youth engagement.
Every community has its own unique culture, perspectives, and challenges. Gabriel is one of several artists that has celebrated and explored his community through his original content. Gabriel also went beyond this by producing French content that is not about the Francophone community. So I know in 2011 you spearheaded the project Ceci est notre message, which translates to This is our message. Can you tell us a little bit about this project and what inspired you to undertake it?
So this was 2011, and I think a couple years earlier, either for the US midterms or for the 2008 presidential election, a bunch of Hollywood celebrities had come out with an ironic campaign called Don't Vote. It was them just on a white screen speaking right into camera, ironically saying, don't vote, it's not worth it, because who cares about X, Y, or Z issue? And then obviously they spin it around at the end and encourage you to sign up to vote if you care about those issues. And it was an effective campaign and all that, but I really liked the format. And I decided, instead of doing kind of a conventional documentary, I wanted to do what we ended up calling une œuvre porte-parole, or un film porte-parole, which I guess in English would kind of translate into like a megaphone film or like a mouthpiece film, where we wrote a 20-minute-ish monologue and gave it to 16 different young faces from our community to speak right into the camera and intercut between them. And we kind of just like unloaded everything that we had on our hearts about our experience of growing up in the Franco-Manitoban community. We talked about all kinds of different topics like accent and cultural symbols and representation in the media, our relationship with Quebec, our experience coming up through the educational system, because something that is characteristic of my generation is that I went into kindergarten in 95, or my class went into kindergarten in 95. And that would have been the second year that the Franco-Manitoban School Division had come into existence. I'm one of the first generations to have entirely gone through his entire French language schooling from kindergarten through to university in a French language, in a fully French language ecosystem, fully administered by Franco-Manitobans. So we had a lot on our mind, and we wanted to share it with other generations, and we wanted to share it with other people, because there were a lot of truths that we were speaking in late night conversations in basements or in bars or whatever, but hadn't really been stated publicly. So it ended up being that, exactly what I described, a 20-minute straight down the barrel monologue from a group of 16 young people who identified as Francophone in Manitoba, talking about the different issues that there was on their hearts. The one thing that I'll say about that is what we were most struck by is how much it resonated with other French communities and how far it resonated. Like, not just Saskatchewan and Ontario or like Alberta and BC, but the Maritimes, like Acadian populations out in the Maritimes, especially the Nova Scotian Acadians, who have a very similar like kind of statistical makeup as Franco-Manitobans. The Louisiana Cajuns, second and third language French speakers from Latin American countries. The film ended up being seen, I think, 16,000 times over the different platforms in 5 or 6 different countries and all across Canada, according to our metrics. We were surprised at how universal the experience was. We thought we were writing about our little Franco-Manitoban experience, and we were just writing to other Franco-Manitobans, and it exploded way beyond that. And that was one of the first inklings that I had that we were maybe onto something.
more recently in 2019, so 8 years after the original, you came up with the sequel. Cela était notre message. This was our message. So can you tell us a little bit about this project and how it kind of followed up on kind of the points that were brought up and discussed in the first one?
I'm going to throw it back at you, André. What do you, and this is like, I call it an exercise in ego or whatever, but I'm genuinely curious, like, when did you first come to see that message, and what was your experience of seeing it or experiencing it?
So I remember seeing it originally, like around the time that it came out. So I think that was 2011, right? So I was kind of in high school at that time, and I remember seeing it. And the big thing that definitely resonated with me was this idea of teachers telling you, like, don't speak in English. Like, that's bad. That's the taboo language, right? Which really is not the most effective way of doing it. You don't want to speak French because it's not English, right? You want to speak French because it's your mother tongue, because there's a lot of culture there, because you're attending all these events that you love, like, for example, the Festivals Voyageur and all these other events. And there were just a lot of things that you could kind of just think internally. You're like, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. And this project really kind of just shared it with everyone, kind of demonstrated that a lot of these thoughts that we kind of realized that this is kind of odd, a lot of other people were thinking, yeah, this is odd indeed, and this is probably not the best approach, and this is something we should be fixing.
You're right. That was the main message, is like, we're tired of English being vilified. Being bilingual is a massive advantage in Canada. And we're actually speaking to Francophones, saying we're proud that we speak good English and that we can act as a bridge between both cultures and experience the full value of both. So back to your original question, Cela était un message was simply the sequel to that. In 2019, 8 years later, there was both a desire on my part and on the Conseil Jeunesse Provinciale's part to revisit those themes with a lot of the same participants, to see how we felt now in our late 20s, and to revisit both the impact that Ceci et Notre Message had and whether the conversation had shifted. The biggest thing that I got out of that conversation is how much progress we had made in just talking about the issues. I feel like I virtually did nothing. I just kind of like tried to create the best space I could, and then 20 incredibly eloquent, articulate people came and sat down and bore their souls for 4 hours. And it turned into the delightful 110 minutes that is up online.
I want to talk about a really ambitious project that you have, which was the production and filming of Idiosyn, which is a feature-length French movie that was produced in Manitoba. So actually, I remember I attended at the premiere of that movie. And there was one, like, after the movie, you were answering questions, and other folks that were involved in the movie were answering questions. And one thing that really stood out for me was that it's important that we have cultural content that's produced in French that's not only just talking about French in Manitoba and other settings like that, because Idiosyn was not about the Francophone community at all. So I'm hoping you can kind of talk to us a little bit more about this movie and what inspired you to make a movie such as Idiosyn.
But when I went over to writing my first professional feature film, I decided that I wanted to kind of create a world in which the French language was just a normal part of living, and that in and of itself would be a statement of the community having arrived to a kind of stable equilibrium, that it was an achievement in and of itself that French could be portrayed as a normal integrated part of living your life, and that it wasn't a perpetual struggle, and that it wasn't something that was perpetually on your mind. So I made a story about two university students who discover that a company is greenwashing a new environmental initiative and work to expose that company. And that story could have happened in New York. It could have happened in Seattle. It could have happened in Mexico City or Delhi or Riyadh. But the underlying statement was that it was happening in Winnipeg, in the French community. And it was Francophones who spoke like us and had our outlook on life that were living out this story. That was one of the goals of it. I mean, the main goal was to tell a great story and like achieve making a film, which are all in and of themselves difficult goals to achieve. But it was definitely a conscious, unconscious aspiration of mine to just kind of normalize la francophonie in Manitoba without addressing it once.
So we've been talking a little bit about, your previous works and everything, and you kind of hinted at it in terms of the English translation of your 2019 documentary. But I guess we'd be just kind of curious, what's down the pipeline? What sort of projects are you currently engaged with?
I'm very passionate about youth engagement, political awareness, cultural identity, environmentalism, and the documentary projects that I'm currently developing, writing, directing, all touch on those different themes, all for French language broadcasters nationally. One of the projects that I can talk about, I'm working on the second season of La Terre en nous, The Earth Within Us, which is an eco documentary series for APTN in French, for APTN's French language programming, starring and hosted by this phenomenal human being, Christian Pilon. He's a Métis canoe builder from the Ottawa region who travels coast to coast looking for innovative solutions and people acting to restore humanity's relationship with nature and equilibrium with it. And we're filming it right now, and it's likely going to be broadcast next year in summer or fall 2022. Other than that, I'm working, I co-direct with several other directors from across Canada, a series plainly titled Hors Québec, Outside of Quebec, which is a documentary series for TVA, which the best way I can describe it, it's kind of the market equivalent of CTV, but in French. So like a large national French language broadcaster that isn't the CBC. And currently I'm working on a couple other documentary projects that are, my industry works on a long timeline. We're talking on a 2 or 5 year scope, but for those to happen, you have to start working on those now. But I'm very intrigued with our relationship, and not just the Francophone community relationship, but the Canadian public's relationship to our democracy, especially as we see the tumultuous democratic experiences of our neighbors in the South. How can we better improve, enhance, and diversify our relationship to our democracy and our democratic system in Canada is a question that I've been asking myself as of late. And I've got a few creative partners that I'm working on a project with. Those are the kinds of things that are now occupying my brain. And it's going to be interesting how that falls out in the coming years.
Yeah, no, those sound like really interesting ideas. And again, you're touching on the topics that are just like everyone's thinking about: issues of climate change, issues of democracy, again, looking stateside. So it's exciting to see those issues tackled in the coming years. Now, we have one last question for final thoughts, but it's something that's been, getting in my cranium throughout this discussion. And it's my experience. I went to an Anglophone school, throughout my whole life. And so French was taught kind of as like, you go to French class, and it was not the primary reason for school, at least how I grew up. But one of the things that always stuck out for me in French, and I'd be curious for both of your thoughts on this, was when I think of my French learning, it was télé français. So you had a talking pineapple, and that was it. I gotta know, what is your perception on that show and its impact? I'm just very curious.
André, are you familiar with Télé Français?
No, I've never heard of this before.
Okay, you are in for a wild ride, sir. Ian, I think I only learned of the existence of Télé Français maybe 2 or 3 years ago, tops. So apparently, some schools in the Francophone division did use Télé Français in like elementary school classrooms. That was not my case at all. It was nowhere on my radar. And I think it was primarily used as a second language tool, which is why you would have had a much more extensive experience with it than I would have, or André would have. Boy, where to even start? Like that needs reams of context. Just like I don't know if you guys have show notes, but you must absolutely post at least 5 or 6 YouTube links to Télé Français for everybody to enjoy and revel in the spectacular, out of the box nature, is how I'm going to describe it generously, of a talking, dancing pineapple teaching you such words as téléphone. That's my understanding of it. What was your experience?
You're absolutely right. Something stuck in my cranium from like thinking back to my early education and when teachers are teaching French for the first time. what were the things that you remember back in those times, and how do you kind of create enthusiasm for it? And I think it's less about what you learned. It was more the randomness of a talking pineapple being the spokesperson for learning French. That was very confusing to me. But it was something that even, I remember graduating, like, and this is a very long time ago, but like, the French teacher who taught in grade 4 and 5, she brought up Tele Français, like at our graduation, and we all remembered, and that's like, years after the fact. And again, so again, I was just more curious for your hot take on Tele Français. So I really appreciate you going that direction. Yeah, Gabriel, this has been a very insightful conversation. I really appreciate you digging deep, and you talked about your own documentaries of how you kind of just let the guests talk, and we've kind of done a little bit here with you, and just being able to hear your thought on Francophone culture and the communities and what kind of ties it together. It's been really interesting just to listen to your ideas and your thoughts on this, and I guess we're going to just conclude with any sort of just general sort of, do you have any final thoughts on this idea of the Francophone community and the culture, or I guess like kind of tied to this, where would you like to see the conversation or the discourse go moving into the future?
Yeah, I think about this often, and it depends on the day. So I'm going to give you my answer for today. I grew up, like I said, in a generation that hadn't experienced a lot of both the social and the legal political struggles of the Francophone community, typical of like the Georges Forêt era or the Léo Robert era, 60s through 80s, la crise linguistique du Manitoba as well, the Manitoba linguistic crisis of the 80s. I grew up in a very nurturing, like culturally safe and very nurturing community and environment. Like I said, was one of the first generations to fully live out their lives in that ecosystem and in that frame of mind and space. That definitely has given me and a lot of people in my generation a different outlook on their identity, and probably a much less combative one than previous generations. But then the question becomes like, what do we make of that identity and that culture in a world that is rapidly fragmenting? And I use that both in the positive and negative senses, like fragmenting into smaller groups that can now connect with each other regardless of geographical location or isolation, can now network and feel less alone. And now I can just as easily enjoy a film in Hindi subtitled in English as I can a Québécois movie, as I can, a local piece of TV. Those now exist all on the same platform, and it becomes a lot harder for the Franco-Manitoban community, and especially the arts and culture, to compete in that space. I don't have a single answer for you today, and I most likely won't for the next several decades. But that's an ongoing conversation that us as artists and the broader community have to have, because there is going to be a cultural reckoning at some point when the critical mass kind of shifts or tips. And then all of a sudden there are fewer people for whom it is their natural reflex to always reach for a French piece of art or culture or media first. And again, I'm not prepared to say that that's a bad thing. It's just a thing. And how we deal with it is the real question, not whether it's good or bad. So those are the questions that I'm asking myself right now.
Perfect. Well, Gabriel, this has been a very interesting conversation. Thanks a lot for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
It was my absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Beyond Riel. Join us on our next episodes when we ask the question, who is part of the Francophone community? We will be talking with Blandine Tona, a French-speaking immigrant from Cameroon, as well as Derek Bentley, whose first language is English and is now extensively involved in the Francophone community. Executive producers and hosts are André Marchildon and Ian T.D. Thompson. Technical producer is Frédérick Demers, and consulting producer is Gabriel Tougas. The music you hear on Beyond Riel is by Rayan. To hear more of her music, visit rayannah.com. That's RAYANNAH.com. Beyond Riel is a UMFM 101.5 limited series broadcasted out of the University of Manitoba. For more information on the series, visit umfm.com.